So the other day I made a video talking about what if the UFC could make any fighter they wanted to on the roster be champion. And as I was scrolling through reading some of the comments, I came across one that asked me, Kendall, you should make a video just like this one, but doing the complete opposite. And so after reading that, I thought to myself, what a glorious idea. That sounds like a perfect video that I could make to follow up that video. And here I am following up that video. And that's basically the whole intro. What I'm going to do for this video is go through every single UFC division and pick a fighter who the UFC does not want to be champion or even hate if they became champion. So you've probably seen the thumbnail, you've probably seen the title. There's no further explanation needed. Let's get right into this. All right, so here we go. We have a black screen next to me. I'm going to reveal each fighter one by one from each division and pick a certain fighter who I believe personally the UFC would hate, despise, or just flat out not want them to become champion of their division. So we're going to start off with flyweight here. And flyweight I think is very difficult, but I think if there was one fighter who they wouldn't want to become champion at flyweight, I'm probably going to take Brandon Royval. The truth is that flyweight is in such a difficult position right now because there is no big names who they want to become champion, and there's not really any bad names as well. If I had to give an opinion about what the UFC thinks of flyweight, I think they just don't care about the division. Obviously, they want it to succeed, but I don't think they really care about who is champion currently at flyweight. And maybe you can blame the lack of popularity for the flyweight division on several different things. It could be because the UFC doesn't put enough effort into the division. It could be the fighters themselves ruining the division, or it could just be an inherent trait of flyweight because they are small 125-pound men. You're not going to see many KOs from them. So maybe the division is just flat out boring naturally. I was thinking about doing Brandon Moreno for this, but I thought to myself, well, he still has that Latino in him. The Mexican market, the UFC still wants to dive into. So I don't really think Moreno would be the best one. I think the UFC probably would still want Moreno to be champion, even though he has taken some losses to Brandon Royval being one of them. And I know Royval has some Latino heritage in him, but I still think he kind of falls in line with a typical American if you were to talk to him. I don't think the Latino fan base is really gravitating towards Royval. I think that's more served towards Brandon Moreno. But let's be real here. Royval has already lost to Pantoja, so him getting another title shot probably wouldn't be on their bingo card. They probably wouldn't even want that to happen. So I think Royval being the next champion wouldn't really progress the flyweight division any further. In fact, I think it would just only bring it down. Now, I like Royval, I like his style, but I don't think it's necessarily a style you can really gravitate towards in terms of entertainment. And I think the UFC has their eyes on other fighters at flyweight, like a Magomed Ankalaev, like a Manel Kape, like even a Steve Erceg still. I just think Royval kind of falls at the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to who the UFC wants to be champion. And now moving on to bantamweight, I think this one is pretty clear who the UFC does not want to be champion, and that is Merab Dvalishvili. This could be his own fault, maybe being open in his own interviews, telling the UFC he would rather have Aljo get a title shot over him doesn't really benefit him that much. Maybe the UFC probably didn't like that so much, so they have avoided giving Merab the next title shot. I still think he'll fight Sean O'Malley next, but we'll see what happens with that. Maybe Corey Sandhagen can take that spot. We'll see what happens, but I think the UFC has been pretty clear with their actions that they don't really necessarily care too much for Merab. But I think what outweighs the UFC's dislike for Merab is the fact that Sean O'Malley is champion. Let's be real here. Sean O'Malley is the UFC's golden boy. They want him to remain champion for as long as possible. They want him to have a good title reign. He is the biggest name at bantamweight right now. O'Malley is. So Merab becoming champion would only ruin that because he would have to go through Sean O'Malley. And by nature, Merab being mainly a grappler, he is a very, very big threat to O'Malley. So I think the UFC wants to keep Merab as far away as possible from O'Malley. It's only up to Merab to actually make him undoubtable and earn the next title shot, which I think he has earned it. But the UFC, they might require a little bit more from Merab, and if O'Malley is not pushing for that fight, they'll probably do whatever in their power to keep Merab from getting that title shot next. But moving on to featherweight. Featherweight is kind of difficult, if I'm being honest with you. There's plenty of guys who don't really make too much sense. Maybe you can argue them for and for not being on this list, but I chose Brian Ortega by default, I think. The thing about Brian Ortega is the fact that he's already lost to Volk. He's already lost to Holloway. Him being champion would kind of ruin the credibility of the featherweight belt. If Ortega went out there and won the championship belt, I still don't think people would view him as the best featherweight on earth. I think him and Yair Rodriguez kind of fall into that category. But overall, Ortega's just kind of here because the UFC, they still like Volk. Obviously, they love Topuria. Obviously, they love Holloway. I think out of those three guys, they really wouldn't mind who would become champion because let's say Holloway beats Topuria, then there's an argument that he beats Volk in a rematch. So when it comes to Ortega, you can argue against it. I don't really mind it. I just can't really find anybody else who would really fit the bill. I guess you could put a Edson Barboza on here, but that's pretty obvious. I think the UFC is pretty fine with Evloev right now, so they wouldn't mind pushing him. So I think it's either Ortega or Yair, and that's really it. But moving on to lightweight, this one again is pretty difficult, but I think it goes to Mateusz Gamrot. Let's be real here. Mateusz Gamrot's style is just not one to be a great champion. He's not really a big name either. He's mainly a grappler and not even like a Dagestani grappler. So that gives him some minus points. If you're not Dagestani and you're a grappler, the UFC typically just doesn't like you. And even with that, Mateusz Gamrot's personality is not anything to gawk at, especially him even beating Fiziev by a knee injury doesn't really help his stock at all. So Mateusz Gamrot kind of goes in here because the UFC, they like Gaethje, they like Poirier, they like a Holloway to fight at lightweight, they like an Islam, they like a Conor, they even like a Sarukian. So Gamrot kind of just falls down the list until you finally hit his name and you're like, okay, this guy, the UFC probably doesn't want Gamrot to be champion. I like Gamrot. I think Gamrot's good, but there's a reason why Sarukian was getting pushed more than Gamrot. There's a reason why Sarukian got Oliveira over Mateusz Gamrot, and I don't think it's because they like Gamrot especially. But moving on to welterweight, and I know this one might seem a bit idiotic, but I think it is Belal Muhammad. They don't really like Belal Muhammad, and it's kind of understandable why. Belal doesn't get any finishes. His personality does not resonate with anybody. And I know Belal is fighting Leon next for that belt, so you might call me an idiot for that. But I think the UFC kind of begrudgingly did this fight. They really didn't want to make Belal get the next shot, but they kind of just had to because all the fans were calling for it. There wasn't really any riot for Belal to get the next shot, but I think the UFC kind of saw all the matchups and were like, I guess it has to be Belal, but I can firmly guarantee you the UFC, I think, is completely rooting for Leon to win this matchup. They don't want Belal to be champion. I think that would be pay-per-view poison in the UFC's eyes. Now, Belal is very, very good. He's a very talented fighter. It's just that his style is not that entertaining. His personality is not that entertaining. So there's not much meat on the bone when it comes to Belal, and the UFC does know that. And I think if Belal does beat Leon and become champion, the UFC is going to find a way to get that belt off of him real quick. I'm talking about quick turnarounds, 3 months at most. I'm talking about if he's injured, he's still fighting. If not, he's stripped. There's an interim belt. They're going to force Belal's hand to take unfavorable matchups in the future if he does happen to beat Leon. But I'm telling you, they don't want Belal to beat Leon. But moving on to middleweight, I chose Sean Strickland for this one. Maybe you could pick somebody else. You could pick a Vettori of all people, but I think Sean Strickland's personality does not resonate with the UFC very well, and they know that. Now, Sean Strickland is a big name now, and people do like him, and people will tune in to watch his fights. However, him talking on the microphone is a dangerous thing to have. Sean Strickland with a microphone in his hand makes the UFC actively cringe. I bet he has at least 10 PR guys before he goes on stage for an interview tell him, Sean, let's relax for this interview, please. Because the UFC knows whatever comes out of Sean Strickland's mouth is probably not going to be good for sponsors. It's not going to be good for business. And so therefore, they don't want him to probably be champion. And that's really about it when it comes to Sean Strickland. Maybe you could say it's his style. Strickland's style isn't the most entertaining outright. He does have a plethora of boring fights in the UFC. It's mainly his personality that's carried him along this far and made him a pretty big name in the UFC, I would say. But the reason why he's a big name with the way he talks on the microphone, the UFC just doesn't like. It's, again, not good for sponsors or for business. So I think Sean Strickland takes the cake on this one for the fighter who the UFC probably does not want to be champion. And one thing I forgot to mention, I think the fact that the UFC gave Adesanya DDP over Sean Strickland pretty much tells you all you need to know. After Strickland to beat Costa, I think it was pretty clear that he was the next guy in line to fight DDP. So the UFC making Adesanya leapfrog over Strickland to fight DDP, I think is pretty clear a tactical play to produce more money and to kind of let Strickland sit by the wayside for a little bit of time. But we move on to light heavyweight, and this one I think is probably one of the easier ones on this list, and that is Magomed Ankalaev for light heavyweight. This guy doesn't have too many entertaining fights. He does have some finishes like against Johnny Walker, but overall Ankalaev doesn't have much personality and his fights can be pretty stale at times. That Thiago Santos fight I think sold Magomed Ankalaev as a guy the UFC does not want to be champion. I know he is Russian and I believe he is Dagestani, but he's not Dagestani enough for the UFC to want to get behind him. There's just other fighters at light heavyweight right now that just have a way more exciting style than Magomed Ankalaev. You have Pereira, you have Yuri, and those two are pretty much enough to convince the UFC that Magomed Ankalaev is probably not their guy at light heavyweight. So it's kind of the same deal for Magomed Ankalaev as like a Merab or even a Belal. He has to make himself undoubtable that there's no other contenders left to fight for the belt besides him because he's beaten them all. But if he can't do that, or even if he loses, they're going to send him to the back of the line and make him fight a top 15 guy, a guy who is at the back end of light heavyweight. Now, lastly, we move on to heavyweight, the final division. This one is pretty simple. It is Tom Aspinall, but here's my take with this. Tom Aspinall in the future, the UFC is going to love him. They're going to want him to be a dominant champion. But Tom Aspinall now, the UFC does not like whatsoever. If Jon Jones was not champion right now, Tom Aspinall would be their golden boy. They would fully get behind Tom Aspinall. But since Jon Jones is the current champion, they don't want to displease Jon Jones whatsoever. So they're going to have to put Tom Aspinall aside and make sure he doesn't fight for the actual real belt. And then he's going to have to sit out and fight Curtis Blaydes to defend his interim belt, which is, I think, pretty blasphemous. I think if you do win the interim belt, your next fight should be the champion of the division, unless something is completely wrong. And I think Jon Jones has had enough time to heal to fight Tom Aspinall in the future, but he's still pushing for that Miocic fight. So it is what it is when it comes to Tom Aspinall. It sucks for him right now. I do believe in the future the UFC will get behind Tom Aspinall, but currently as things stand, as of June 21st, 2024, I don't think the UFC wants Tom Aspinall to be champion right now, even if he is the interim champion. But if you don't agree with that, I do understand. The next guy I would probably say would be Jailton Almeida. The UFC does not want to get behind Jailton Almeida. They did for a certain period of time, but I think after his Curtis Blaydes loss, the UFC is not liking Jailton Almeida. Heavyweight is kind of weird, but I think Jailton Almeida's style is just not suited for the UFC to like him. Other than that, it would be Tom Aspinall. You could choose either one, Aspinall or Jailton Almeida. I don't really care, but I think right now, the one being screwed over the most by the UFC is Tom Aspinall because they just like Jon Jones more, which is an argument for itself. It can be debated, but I'm going with Tom Aspinall for this video. So there you guys have it. That is every single fighter in every division to the UFC would not want to become champion. If you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, hit the bell icon for notifications. If you agree or disagree, leave a comment in the comment section down below. I like reading your guys' comments, but that's it. I'm out of here. Peace.